The year was structured not by weeks or weekends, but by the agricultural calendar. In spring, seeds were sown. In summer, weeds were pulled and fields maintained. Autumn brought the harvest, a time of intense labor. Winter was quieter but brought its own challenges: food preservation, wood gathering, and mending tools. Each season dictated what tasks were done and when. The fear of a failed harvest loomed constantly. A single poor season could mean starvation. Church bells structured the day just as surely as the seasons shaped the year. Peasants might not have had timepieces, but they knew when to pray, when to work, and when to rest, all thanks to the ringing of bells from the village church. Religion was deeply embedded in their lives. Mass was attended regularly. Saints' days and feast days broke up the monotony of labor. The church was more than a spiritual center. It was the keeper of time. Law and community, religious festivals, like Corpus Christi or All Saints' Day, were both holy and social occasions. Children did not go to school. Literacy was exceedingly rare among peasants. Instead, children worked from an early age, helping with chores, learning the tools of their future lives. Boys might learn to plow, sow, or care for livestock. Girls would learn to spin, sew, cook, and tend to younger siblings. Childhood was short, and death was always near. Infant mortality was high, and illness could sweep through a village with little warning. A child reaching adulthood was a cause for quiet celebration. Despite the hardships, there was rhythm and meaning. Feast days like Easter or the Harvest Festival brought rare moments of joy. Music, dancing, and community games were common during these brief reprieves. Marriage celebrations could last days, and storytelling was a popular evening activity, especially in winter. Oral traditions passed down folklore, local legends, and morality tales. Village life, though hard, was not without its moments of laughter, hope, and shared human connection. Work was communal. Fields were not individually owned, but divided into strips that each family worked. Cooperation was necessary. Plowing, planting, and harvesting required neighbors to help one another. While disputes surely arose, the survival of the village depended on collaboration. Duties were sometimes rotated, and tools were shared. Bonds of kinship and necessity tied the villagers together. Punishments for stepping outside the rules could be severe. Serfs were beholden to their lords. Failing to pay taxes or fulfill work obligations might result in fines, loss of land use, or worse. But lords also had obligations. They were to protect the peasants, maintain justice, and ensure access to land and mills. In some manors, customary rights allowed peasants to collect firewood or graze animals on common land, though such rights were always vulnerable to change. Taxes were paid in kind: grain, eggs, a portion of the harvest. Some went to the local lord, others to the church as tithes. Peasants were also required to work the lord's domain, the portion of land the lord kept for himself, several days a week, in addition to tending their own plots. This system could be deeply unfair, yet it persisted for centuries. Occasionally, peasant uprisings occurred when burdens became too great, but they were rare and often crushed with brutal efficiency. Nightfall brought a return to the hearth. Dinner was similar to breakfast: bread, ale, and stew if it could be managed. The fire would be stoked, and families would huddle for warmth. Light came from tallow candles or oil lamps, but many went to sleep shortly after the sun set. There was little to do and precious energy to conserve. Evenings were sometimes filled with simple entertainment: a song, a tale, or quiet reflection. The home was a refuge from the demands of the fields, however modest it might be. A medieval peasant woke before the sun. Their day began not with alarm clocks or to-do lists, but with the crow of a rooster, the rustle of hay, and the stirring of livestock. The morning air was cool and damp, and the first light of dawn revealed a world of quiet necessity. Life was dictated not by individual ambition, but by the collective rhythm of the seasons and the obligations to land and lord. Most peasants were bound to the land under the manorial system. They lived in small wooden homes, simple structures of wattle and daub. Thatched roofs packed earth floors, and smoky hearths. Often these homes consisted of a single room shared by the entire family, and sometimes even by livestock during harsh winters. Privacy was a luxury they neither expected nor missed. Their meals were humble: porridge made from oats, bread made of rye, and perhaps an onion or a leek plucked from a small garden. Meat was rare. Salted pork or dried fish might make an appearance on feast days or when the harvest was good. A stew known as pottage was a common dish, endlessly simmered with whatever vegetables were on hand, thickened with grains, and occasionally enriched with a. Most peasants lived in villages under a system known as manorialism. The manorial system was the organizing principle of rural life. At the heart of the manor was the lord's estate, usually consisting of a manor house, a church, and perhaps a mill. Surrounding this estate were small plots of land where peasants lived and worked. These peasants were not slaves, but most were serfs tied to the land, obligated to serve the lord in exchange for the right to work a piece of it for themselves. Their homes were modest, built from a mixture of woven sticks and daub mud, straw and animal dung. They were small, dark and smoky. The roofs were thatched with straw, which needed constant maintenance. Inside, the floors were made of packed earth. There was little furniture, perhaps a wooden table, a few stools, and bedding made from straw. A hearth at the center of the home provided heat, a place to cook, and most critically, smoke to preserve meat or deter pests, even if it choked the air and blackened the ceilings. A peasant's day began with the tending of animals. Chickens needed to be fed, pigs inspected, and cows milked. Goats, if they were kept, were particularly valuable for their milk. Horses were rare, usually reserved for lords or knights, but oxen were common and essential for plowing. After feeding the animals, a peasant might take a moment to eat something simple: coarse rye bread dipped in ale or water, or perhaps a bowl of gruel. A meal might be shared in silence, or with hushed murmurs of hope for good weather and a healthy crop. Food was a constant concern. The medieval peasant's diet was meager by modern standards. Bread was a staple made from rye, barley, or oats, depending on what was available. White bread from wheat was a luxury, reserved for the rich. Ale was drunk more than water, not because it was intoxicating, but because it was often cleaner than river or well water. Vegetables were grown in small garden plots. Onions, leeks, cabbages, and beans were common. Meat was rare, often reserved for feast days or hard winters. When it was eaten, it might be salted pork, dried fish, or game caught illegally in the lord's forest. After breakfast, the real work of the day began. Men would head to the fields, carrying tools passed down through generations. Wooden plows drawn by oxen, hoes, sickles, and flails. These were the instruments of survival. Women might remain at home, tending to the garden, mending clothing, spinning wool, or caring for children. But women also worked in the fields when needed, and their labor was equally essential. Children, too, were part of the workforce. From as young as 5 or 6, they would gather firewood, scare birds from crops, or fetch water from the village well. The year was structured not by weeks or weekends, but by the agricultural calendar. In spring, seeds were sown. In summer, weeds were pulled and fields maintained. Autumn brought the harvest, a time of intense labor. Winter was quieter but brought its own challenges: food preservation, wood gathering, and mending tools. Each season dictated what tasks were done and when. The fear of a failed harvest loomed constantly. A single poor season could mean starvation. Church bells structured the day just as surely as the seasons shaped the year. Peasants might not have had timepieces, but they knew when to pray, when to work, and when to rest, all thanks to the ringing of bells from the village church. Religion was deeply embedded in their lives. Mass was attended regularly. Saints' days and feast days broke up the monotony of labor. The church was more than a spiritual center. It was the keeper of time, law, and community. Religious festivals, like Corpus Christi or All Saints' Day, were both holy and social occasions. Children did not go to school. Literacy was exceedingly rare among peasants. Instead, children worked from an early age, helping with chores, learning the tools of their future lives. Boys might learn to plow, sow, or care for livestock. Girls would learn to spin, sew, cook, and tend to younger siblings. Childhood was short, and death was always near. Infant mortality was high, and illness could sweep through a village with little warning. A child reaching adulthood was a cause for quiet celebration. Despite the hardships, there was rhythm and meaning. Feast days like Easter or the Harvest Festival brought rare moments of joy. Music, dancing, and community games were common during these brief reprieves. Marriage celebrations could last days, and storytelling was a popular evening activity. Especially in winter, oral traditions passed down folklore, local legends, and morality tales. Village life, though hard, was not without its moments of laughter, hope, and shared human connection. Work was communal. Fields were not individually owned, but divided into strips that each family worked. Cooperation was necessary. Plowing, planting, and harvesting required neighbors to help one another. While disputes surely arose, the survival of the village depended on collaboration. Duties were sometimes rotated, and tools were shared. Bonds of kinship and necessity tied the villagers together. Punishments for stepping outside the rules could be severe. Serfs were beholden to their lords. Failing to pay taxes or fulfill work obligations might result in fines, loss of land use, or worse. But lords also had obligations. They were to protect the peasants, maintain justice, and ensure access to land and mills. In some manors, customary rights allowed peasants to collect firewood or graze animals on common land, though such rights were always vulnerable to change. Taxes were paid in kind, grain, eggs, a portion of the harvest. Some went to the local lord, others to the church as tithes. Peasants were also required to work the lord's domain, the portion of land the lord kept for himself, several days a week. In addition to tending their own plots, this system could be deeply unfair, yet it persisted for centuries. Occasionally, peasant uprisings occurred when burdens became too great, but they were rare and often crushed with brutal efficiency. Nightfall brought a return to the hearth. Dinner was similar to breakfast: bread, ale, and stew if it could be managed. The fire would be stoked, and families would huddle for warmth. Light came from tallow candles or oil lamps, but many went to sleep shortly after the sun set. There was little to do and precious energy to conserve. Evenings were sometimes filled with simple entertainment, a song, a tale, or quiet reflection. The home was a refuge from the demands of the fields, however modest it might be. Illness was common and healthcare rudimentary. Local wise women, midwives, and herbalists tended to the sick, using knowledge passed down orally. Superstition and religion shaped many of their practices. Leprosy, fevers, rashes, and injuries were all threats, and a bad year could decimate a village. Plague, when it came, did not discriminate, but peasants often bore the worst of its aftermath. Burial grounds filled quickly, and survivors carried on with heavy hearts. And yet peasants endured, for generation after generation. They lived and worked the land. They weathered bad harvests, famine, war, and plague. They buried their dead, married, raised children, and sang old songs. Their resilience helped sustain kingdoms, fed armies, and built cathedrals brick by brick. Their labor supported not only themselves, but the entire structure of medieval society. To be a medieval peasant was to be a part of something larger: a village, a community, a field in a wide landscape, a cog in the wheel of feudal society. Though history often forgets their names, they are the quiet majority, the invisible force beneath the pageantry of kings and knights. Their days were long, their nights short, their meals simple, and their lives essential. As the rooster crowed again the next morning, another peasant stirred in the dark. Another day began, just as it had the day before, just as it would for centuries to come. Most peasants were bound to the land under the manorial system. They lived in small wooden homes, simple structures of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, packed earth floors, and smoky hearths. Often these homes consisted of a single room shared by the entire family, and sometimes even by livestock during harsh winters. Privacy was a luxury they neither expected nor missed. Peasants made up the vast majority of the medieval population. Their lives, though largely undocumented, were the bedrock of medieval society. They tilled the land, harvested the food, tended the animals, and paid rents and taxes to lords and kings. Though their days were filled with toil, their roles were vital. Life was not easy, nor was it comfortable, but it was structured, seasonal, and deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. Their homes were modest, built from a mixture of woven sticks and daub, mud, straw, and animal dung. They were small, dark, and smoky. The roofs were thatched with straw, which needed constant maintenance. Inside, the floors were made of packed earth. There was little furniture, perhaps a wooden table, a few stools, and bedding made from straw. A hearth at the center of the home provided heat, a place to cook, and most critically, smoke to preserve meat or deter pests, even if it choked the air and blackened the ceilings. A peasant's day began with the tending of animals. Chickens needed to be fed, pigs inspected, and cows milked. Goats, if they were kept, were particularly valuable for their milk. Horses were rare, usually reserved for lords or knights, but oxen were common and essential for plowing. After feeding the animals, a peasant might take a moment to eat something simple: coarse rye bread dipped in ale or water, or perhaps a bowl of gruel. A meal might be shared in silence, or with hushed murmurs of hope for good weather and a healthy crop. Children did not go to school. Literacy was exceedingly rare among peasants. Instead, children worked from an early age, helping with chores, learning the tools of their future lives. Boys might learn to plow, sow, or care for livestock. Girls would learn to spin, sew, cook, and tend to younger siblings. Childhood was short, and death was always near. Infant mortality was high. and illness could sweep through a village with little warning. A child reaching adulthood was a cause for quiet celebration. Despite the hardships, there was rhythm and meaning. Feast days like Easter or the Harvest Festival brought rare moments of joy. Music, dancing, and community games were common during these brief reprieves. Marriage celebrations could last days, and storytelling was a popular evening activity, especially in winter. Oral traditions passed down folklore, local legends, and morality tales. Village life, though hard, was not without its moments of laughter, hope, and shared human connection. Work was communal. Fields were not individually owned, but divided into strips that each family worked. Cooperation was necessary. Plowing, planting, and harvesting required neighbors to help one another. While disputes surely arose, the survival of the village depended on collaboration. Duties were sometimes rotated, and tools were shared. Bonds of kinship and necessity tied the villagers together. Punishments for stepping outside the rules could be severe. Serfs were beholden to their lords. Failing to pay taxes or fulfill work obligations might result in fines, loss of land use, or worse. But lords also had obligations. They were to protect the peasants, maintain justice, and ensure access to land and mills. In some manors, customary rights allowed peasants to collect firewood or graze animals on common land, though such rights were always vulnerable to change. Taxes were paid in kind: grain, eggs, a portion of the harvest. Some went to the local lord, others to the church as tithes. Peasants were also required to work the lord's domain, the portion of land the lord kept for himself, several days a week. In addition to tending their own plots, this system could be deeply unfair, yet it persisted for centuries. Occasionally, peasant uprisings occurred when burdens became too great, but they were rare and often crushed with brutal efficiency. Nightfall brought a return to the hearth. Dinner was similar to breakfast: bread, ale, and stew if it could be managed. The fire would be stoked, and families would huddle for warmth. Light came from tallow candles or oil lamps, but many went to sleep shortly after the sun set. There was little to do and precious energy to conserve. Evenings were sometimes filled with simple entertainment: a song, a tale, or quiet reflection. The home was a refuge from the demands of the fields, however modest it might be. Illness was common, and healthcare rudimentary. Local wise women, midwives, and herbalists tended to the sick, using knowledge passed down orally. Superstition and religion shaped many of their practices. Leprosy, fevers, rashes, and injuries were all threats, and a bad year could decimate a village. Plague, when it came, did not discriminate, but peasants often bore the worst of its aftermath. Burial grounds filled quickly, and survivors carried on with heavy hearts. And yet peasants endured. For generation after generation, they lived and worked the land. They weathered bad harvests, famine, war, and plague. They buried their dead, married, raised children, and sang old songs. Their resilience helped sustain kingdoms, fed armies, and built cathedrals brick by brick. Their labor supported not only themselves, but the entire structure of medieval society. To be a medieval peasant was to be a part of something larger: a village, a community, a field in a wide landscape, a cog in the wheel of feudal society. Though history often forgets their names, they are the quiet majority, the invisible force beneath the pageantry of kings and knights. Their days were long, their nights short, their meals simple, and their lives essential. As the rooster crowed again the next morning, another peasant stirred in the dark. Another day began, just as it had the day before, just as it would for centuries to come. To truly understand the life of a medieval peasant, one must step away from the towering castles, noble feasts, and grand battles that dominate popular portrayals of the Middle Ages. Instead, one must look to the earth, tilled by countless hands, under endless skies, and the manor, the beating heart of rural medieval society. For while lords and kings wrote the laws and led armies, it was the peasants who fed the kingdom, bound to the rhythms of nature, tradition, and obligation. Most medieval peasants were serfs. A serf was neither slave nor free. Bound to the land, they could not be sold separately from it, but neither could they leave without permission. They inherited their status and passed it to their children. A serf's life was not their own. It was entwined with the land, their community, and the lord they served. This was not merely an economic arrangement, but a deeply social and legal one, governed by long-standing customs that varied from region to region. The structure of the manor was more than a grand house for a local lord. It was an entire economic and administrative unit, the smallest functional cell of the feudal system. At its center stood the manor house, which varied in size and grandeur depending on the wealth of the lord. Some were simple fortified halls, while others resembled small castles. Here lived the lord or his steward, the figure of authority over the surrounding lands and people. Surrounding the manor house were functional buildings, barns to store grain, stables for horses and oxen, bakehouses, blacksmith shops and granaries. There might be a chapel and often a mill, usually located near a stream. But the majority of the manor's land consisted of fields, pastures, woods, and the village, a cluster of peasant cottages, each with its thatched roof, wattle and daub walls, and small garden or yard. These villages were tight-knit communities. Houses were packed close together, and life spilled into shared spaces, the lanes, the churchyard, the communal oven. Children played together, elders told stories, and everyone knew each other's names, business, and burdens. The open field system, central to rural agriculture in medieval Europe, was the open field system, a cooperative method of farming in which large fields were divided into long, narrow strips, each cultivated by different families. These strips were not enclosed by hedges or fences, and the division was both practical and social. No one family received only the most fertile land. Instead, strips were scattered to ensure fairness and to mitigate the risk of crop failure due to poor soil in any one area. The open fields were divided into three major parts: one sown with winter crops like wheat and rye, one with spring crops like barley and oats, and one left fallow, unplanted so the soil could recover its fertility. This three-field system improved upon older two-field practices, increasing yields and reducing the risk of famine. Each year the cycle rotated. Families had to keep track of which field was which, and cooperation was essential. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting were done collectively, timed to the agricultural calendar and often led or overseen by a reeve, a kind of peasant foreman. Labor and life. Peasant families worked their own strips for subsistence. They grew cereal crops, kept chickens, pigs, sometimes a cow, and tended to small gardens of leeks, onions, beans, and herbs. But several days each week were not spent on their own land. They owed labor services to the lord, working his fields, maintaining roads, clearing brush, gathering firewood, or helping with construction. This was called week work and was unpaid. Instead, it was the price of their tenancy. In exchange for the right to farm certain strips, they owed time and toil. During harvest, the burden increased. Extra labor, known as boon work, was expected. Peasants could be summoned en masse to bring in the lord's crops, under tight deadlines, regardless of their own needs. This could cause tension. A poor harvest might mean peasants struggled to gather their own food, even as they were compelled to work long hours for the lord. There were also dues and taxes, many of which now sound quaint but were deeply resented. Harriet, when a peasant died, their best animal, or sometimes their best tool, was surrendered to the lord. Tallage, a tax levied arbitrarily, often to raise money for wars or construction. Merchant, a fee paid when a daughter married, compensating the lord for the loss of her labor. Tithe, a religious tax, 1/10 of all produce payable to the church. In addition, peasants were legally required to use the lord's mill, bakehouse, and winepress, paying fees each time. These were not optional. Building your own oven or grinding your own grain was considered theft, a threat to the lord's monopoly on income. Governance and custom. Peasants had few formal rights, but they did have a system of justice, the manor court, presided over by the lord or his steward. The court met regularly to handle disputes and infractions. Its jurisdiction was local and based not on codified law, but custom, traditions handed down orally and enforced by community consensus. The court dealt with trespassing animals, broken fences, unpaid debts, and absentee laborers. It also recorded property transfers, inheritances, and marriages, serving as a kind of administrative registry. For the peasant, the manor court was both oppressive and vital. It was where grievances could be aired, but also where fines and punishments were imposed. Justice was not impartial. The lord had the final say. Still, it was a place where community life was regulated, and where, occasionally, a clever or respected peasant could influence outcomes. Protection and community. Despite the burdens, the manor was not merely a system of exploitation. It also offered protection. In an age of bandits, war, and famine, the manor provided a structure. The lord had a duty, though not always fulfilled, to defend his tenants, offer food during crisis, and uphold order. In times of crop failure, lords sometimes distributed seed or grain. In conflict, the manor might become a refuge. In winter, when life slowed and the threat of hunger loomed, The manor's storehouses could be the difference between survival and death. Peasant life was governed by the calendar. In spring, fields were plowed and sown. In summer, weeds were pulled, and animals were grazed. In autumn, the harvest was brought in with feverish effort. Winter was quieter but not restful. Tools had to be repaired, firewood gathered, and livestock kept alive. Each season had its rituals, expectations, and labors. Religious festivals marked time. Saints' days, feast days, and holidays offered brief moments of respite, often linked to the church. Even the humblest village might host processions, bonfires, or dancing. Inequality and resistance. Though bound by feudal ties, not all peasants were equal. Some held more land, had better tools, or learned skills that made them valuable. Smiths, carpenters, weavers, and masons. These skilled laborers could trade services for goods, earn favors, or secure better treatment. A few rose further, through careful savings. Some peasants leased land independently, or bought their freedom from serfdom, becoming yeomen, freeholding farmers with rights and a degree of autonomy. Still, the system was rife with tension. Lords raised rents, enforced harsh penalties, or demanded more labor. Peasants resisted in subtle ways, delaying tasks, neglecting duties, or accidentally losing tools. At times, resistance turned to revolt. Other revolts occurred across Europe, in France, Germany, Italy, each fueled by injustice and hope. Change and decline. The 14th century brought catastrophe and opportunity. The Black Death swept across Europe, killing perhaps half the population. Fields were left untended, whole villages vanished. But for survivors, scarcity of labor meant new leverage. Peasants demanded wages, some fled to towns. Others bargained for better terms. Lords tried to hold the old system together through law. The statute of laborers in England, for example, but the tide had turned. Over time, serfdom declined. In England, by the 15th century, it was largely gone. In Western Europe, wage labor and tenant farming became more common. In Eastern Europe, however, serfdom endured, or even worsened, into the early modern era. The manor system faded, replaced by new forms of agriculture, commerce, and land ownership, but its shadow lingered in the landscape, in the names of fields and villages, and in the collective memory of struggle. Legacy. For centuries, the manor was the world of the peasant. It shaped their work, their relationships, their hopes and fears. It was a world of obligation, yes, but also of cooperation, tradition, and quiet resilience. Though often overlooked by chroniclers and poets, the peasants' labor underpinned everything. Without their grain, wool, meat, and taxes, no castle could be built, no army sustained, no cathedral raised. They were anonymous in their time, but they were the foundation, the daily, unseen, unrecorded work of the many men. Women and children bent over fields, fed the kingdoms, paid the priests, and endured the storms of history. The manor, with all its injustice and intimacy, was not just a system, it was a way of life. A place of suffering, yes, but also of survival, of continuity, of quiet, stubborn dignity. In the soil they tilled and the customs they upheld, the peasants of medieval Europe shaped the world more than history has ever admitted. In the world of the medieval peasant, life was not lived in isolation, but in tight, often cramped quarters where the boundaries between public and private were virtually non-existent. The peasant household was a nucleus of survival, labor, socialization, and faith. The very structure of the home reflected the priorities of the people who lived within it. Most peasant homes were simple structures made of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, straw and animal dung, and thatched roofs. They were dark, smoky, and cold in winter, yet warm and filled with the sounds of life. The floors were usually made of compacted earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw to absorb dirt and moisture. There was rarely a chimney. Smoke from the hearth escaped through a hole in the roof or a small window, blackening the ceiling over time. Furniture was minimal: a bench, a rough table, and perhaps a wooden chest or bed shared by multiple family members. Tools hung on the walls, and clothing might be stored in bundles or simply hung from pegs. Families were often large, out of both necessity and culture. Many children meant more hands to help with farm work, tending animals or gathering firewood. Infant mortality was high, so not every child born survived to adulthood. But even so, households frequently included extended family, grandparents, cousins, and in some cases, non-relatives such as servants or lodgers. The household might also include domesticated animals, chickens scratching on the floor, a pig by the hearth, or even a cow tied near the door. Privacy, as we conceive it today, was absent, Curtains or hangings might demarcate sleeping areas, but people lived, worked, and slept in close quarters. Marriage was a social and economic bond, as much as a romantic one. Peasant marriages were often arranged within the village or among nearby communities. While the church required consent from both parties, families played a significant role in the arrangements, and dowries or bride prices were often exchanged. Once married, a couple became an economic unit. The husband tended the plow and fields. The wife managed the home, cared for animals, preserved food, wove textiles, and bore and raised children. Gender roles were distinct but not inflexible. During planting or harvest, women and children worked alongside men in the fields. In times of crisis, the elderly or infirm might step in where they could. Despite the harsh conditions, family bonds were strong. Parents taught children practical skills from an early age: how to tend livestock, gather herbs, spin wool, or mend tools. Songs, stories, and sayings were passed down orally, weaving culture and memory into the rhythm of daily life. The hearth was the center of the home, not only for cooking but as a gathering place. Meals were eaten together, often from shared dishes, with spoons or bread used to scoop food. Food was plain but nourishing. A typical meal might consist of pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, black bread made from coarse rye or barley flour, and perhaps cheese or salted meat on rare occasions. Meals were supplemented with seasonal vegetables, herbs, eggs, and what little dairy the household could spare. Water was often unsafe to drink, so weak ale was the standard beverage, even for children. Faith was the great unifier of medieval life. The church was ever present, from the tallest cathedral spires in cities to the modest stone chapels in rural villages. Even if a peasant could not read or write, they could recite prayers, understand biblical stories through murals and stained glass, and follow the cycle of feast and fast that structured the liturgical year. The church calendar shaped life with a rhythm more powerful than any clock. Ordinary time was punctuated by Lent, Advent, feast days of saints, the Nativity, Easter, Pentecost, and dozens of local holy days. Religion permeated the peasant worldview. Everything, illness, famine, good harvests, and the birth of children, was attributed to God's will. People believed in divine intervention and the presence of both angels and demons in the everyday world. Villagers might pray to saints for specific concerns: St. Anthony for lost items, St. Isidore for farmers, St. Bridget for domestic matters. Holy relics were revered: fragments of saints' bones, cloth, or even drops of blood were housed in reliquaries and believed to offer divine protection. The village priest held a unique position. He might be the only person in the area who could read Latin, and he acted not only as a spiritual advisor, but also as a teacher, chronicler, and sometimes even a medic. He baptized children, presided over marriages, gave last rites, and celebrated Mass. He also enforced moral codes, heard confessions, and reported to higher church authorities. His sermons reminded parishioners of the sins of sloth and greed, the need for humility, and the promise of heaven for the faithful. Pilgrimages, journeys to holy sites, were one of the most significant religious undertakings a peasant might make. Though costly and difficult, many saved for years to visit shrines such as Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or even Rome or Jerusalem. Pilgrimages were acts of devotion and penitence. Some were taken in thanks for a healing, others in hopes of divine intervention. Festivals provided relief from the rigor of daily life. Holy days were both sacred and celebratory, blending solemn worship with joyful community gatherings. May Day celebrated fertility and renewal. Young people danced around the maypole, flowers were gathered, and village greens came alive with song. At harvest festivals, people gave thanks for the season's bounty with communal feasts. Music and games, midwinter festivals, such as Christmas and the 12 days following, were occasions of gift-giving, storytelling, and warmth against the year's darkest days. Ale brewed weak for daily consumption flowed freely at festivals. Music came from simple instruments: flutes, drums, lyres, and fiddles. Dancing was communal and often energetic. People wore garlands, painted faces, and acted out mummers' plays, dramatized tales of death and rebirth, good and evil. These festivals were rooted in both Christian tradition and older pagan customs. The church often adapted these practices to maintain cultural continuity. Peasants also marked life's milestones with ceremony. Christenings, marriages, and funerals were religious and social events. A marriage might be followed by days of celebration, feasting and dancing. Death brought mourning and ritual, Prayers for the dead were believed to help souls pass through purgatory. Families lit candles and commissioned masses in the deceased's name, if they could afford it. The cycle of life was deeply tied to the cycle of the land and the liturgical calendar. Planting aligned with spring festivals, harvest came with autumnal observances, winter brought rest, reflection, and hope. The new year, often celebrated on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, marked a spiritual and agricultural rebirth. Stories and legends flourished in these times. Folk tales told of saints, miracles, ghosts, and moral lessons. Oral tradition preserved history in song and story, the exploits of King Arthur, Robin Hood, or local heroes. Some stories had pagan origins. Wrapped in Christian symbolism, superstition was strong. Villagers avoided certain days for weddings or travel, carried charms against illness, and believed in omens and dreams. Community was essential. The village was a web of relationships forged through birth, marriage, labor, and faith. Neighbors helped each other with difficult tasks, building houses, bringing in crops, nursing the sick. Disputes were inevitable, but the social fabric depended on cooperation. Festivals and faith served to reinforce these bonds. Guilds and fraternities also played a role. In larger villages and towns, craftsmen and laborers might belong to religious guilds, associations dedicated to a patron saint. These provided social support, mutual aid, and hosted special feasts. Women sometimes formed their own groups around charitable or devotional purposes. For children, life was harsh but not without joy. Games were played with balls, hoops, sticks, and improvised toys. Rhymes and riddles were passed from older to younger siblings. Education, if it occurred, came from the priest or monastery schools, though most peasant children learned through observation and participation in family work. Though life was bounded by toil, it was not devoid of beauty or laughter. The change of seasons brought variety. Love and humor found expression in songs and proverbs. People sang as they worked, and children played by the hedgerows. Festivals were moments of magic when the ordinary was suspended, and everyone, from the poorest cotter to the wealthiest villager, shared in the joy. Seasonal festivals often included contests and sporting games, wrestling, archery, sack races, or tug-of-war. In some areas, villagers elected a lord of misrule during Christmas or midsummer, someone to preside over festivities in a playful inversion of social order. These brief suspensions of hierarchy allowed people to laugh, release tension, and reinforce community through shared humor. In sum, the life of a medieval peasant was shaped not only by obligation and hardship, but also by the richness of community, the structure of faith, and the rhythm of celebration. Family, faith, and festivals offered purpose and solace, vital pillars in a world where survival was uncertain. But belonging was sure. This deeply interconnected existence, though alien to modern sensibilities, reveals a humanity as complex and vibrant as our own, rooted in the soil, lifted by prayer and carried forward by song. Let's take a long, slow walk through the fields of myth and misunderstanding. When we look back at the medieval world, especially at the lives of peasants, we often do so through a distorted lens. Centuries of storytelling, misrepresentation in books, films, and pop culture have built up an image of the peasant that is often simplistic, and sometimes outright wrong. So let's gently sweep those misconceptions aside. One by one, no sudden movements, just soft steps and quiet thoughts. The myth of the dirty peasant. Perhaps the most common misconception about medieval peasants is that they were filthy, covered in grime, unwashed, permanently smelly. In truth, hygiene was much more important to them than we often assume. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it had moral, social, and spiritual dimensions. In Christian Europe, cleanliness was associated with godliness. Being clean wasn't just pleasant, it was virtuous. Now they didn't have hot showers or indoor plumbing, no foaming hand soaps or eucalyptus-scented shampoos. But medieval people bathed more often than you might think. When the weather was warm, they washed in rivers, lakes, and ponds. In the colder months, they used wooden tubs filled with heated water when they could manage it. Soap made from animal fat and wood ash was rough but functional. And while it wouldn't leave you smelling like lilacs, it did the job. Public bathhouses existed, even in smaller towns, and were used by all social classes, though they eventually fell out of favor due to fears of disease and changing moral attitudes. For much of the Middle Ages, they were quite common, and brushing teeth, Not with plastic toothbrushes. No, but with twigs, often frayed at one end to create a primitive brush. Herbal mouth rinses were used, made with ingredients like mint, sage, and vinegar. People chewed aromatic twigs to freshen their breath. They didn't know about bacteria or dental plaque, but they understood the connection between mouth care and feeling well. Clothing was washed too, though it was a laborious process. Linen undergarments were boiled or scrubbed at the local stream. Woolen outer garments were harder to clean, but they were brushed and aired out. Fleas and lice were constant problems, but people fought back against them with combs, oils, and even fumigation with smoke or herbs. Their homes, though modest, were not trash heaps. Floors were swept. Rushes or straw were laid down and replaced regularly. Smoke from the hearth blackened the walls, but it also acted as a mild disinfectant. Windows were few, but they were often covered with cloth or animal bladder to keep out flies. In short, they were not clean by modern standards, but they were not filthy savages. They cared, they tried, and that deserves recognition. The myth of the ignorant peasant. Another stubborn myth is that peasants were ignorant, illiterate, uneducated, backward. Now it's true that most peasants couldn't read or write. Literacy was rare, especially in rural areas. Books were expensive, and education was reserved mostly for clergy, nobles, or the wealthy. But let's not confuse book learning with intelligence. Medieval peasants had a profound, intuitive understanding of the natural world. They knew when to plant and when to harvest, how to read the weather by the clouds, how to predict frost by the stars. They recognized animal behaviors, bird migrations, the scent of the air before a storm. This knowledge wasn't written down, but it was passed from generation to generation, orally, patiently over the years. And there was wisdom in the old stories. Folklore was not just entertainment. It taught lessons, preserved memory, explained the mysteries of the world. Riddles, songs, proverbs, and tales carried the values and insights of centuries. Peasants might not have had books, but they had libraries, vast ones in the minds of their elders. Monks and nobles may have scoffed at peasant superstitions, but those so-called superstitions often carried practical truths. Don't plant after a frost. Don't drink from a stream after a thunderstorm. Watch the bees, watch the cows. Trust the old woman who remembers the famine 30 years ago. And let's not forget the cleverness involved in daily survival. Making clothing from wool, weaving baskets, brewing ale, building carts, repairing tools, trading goods, avoiding taxes, dodging conscription, knowing who to trust and who not to in a village of 50 people. This was a different kind of intelligence, not written but spoken, not academic but ancestral. The myth of the monolithic peasant class. We tend to speak of peasants as if they were all the same, a single gray, shapeless mass. But this is far from the truth. The term peasant covers a broad swath of medieval society. Within it, there were sharp divisions in wealth, status, and freedom. There were landholding peasants, sometimes called yeomen in England, who owned their plots and lived with a measure of independence. These were often hardworking, respected members of the community. They hired laborers, traded goods, and might even accumulate savings. Then there were villeins, bound to the land under the feudal system. They worked their lord's fields, paid rents or provided services, and couldn't leave without permission. But even within this group, there was variation. Some had larger holdings, better livestock, or lighter obligations than others. At the bottom were cotters and bordars, those with tiny plots or no land at all. Some worked as day laborers, others as servants, shepherds, or mill hands. These people were the most vulnerable to hunger, disease, and misfortune. And even here, not all was static. Some peasants escaped the countryside and moved to growing towns. Others saved money, bought land, or gained favor with the local lord. A few rose to minor positions of local authority, reeves, bailiffs, or tax collectors. Life was not frozen, it changed. Slowly, yes, but meaningfully. The Black Death in the 14th century upended the social order, wiping out huge portions of the population and giving survivors more bargaining power. Wages rose, mobility increased. Laws were passed to try to force people back into their roles, and many simply ignored them. In short, the peasant class was not a monolith. It was a spectrum, from those clinging to subsistence to those living with modest comfort. Their lives were shaped by fortune, family, politics, and time, just like ours. The myth of the joyless life. Some believe medieval peasants led lives of endless toil. No joy, no rest, no beauty. And yes, life was hard, but it was not unrelenting misery. There were feasts and festivals, days off for saints and holy days. Weddings, births, seasonal celebrations. The rhythms of the year were punctuated by moments of joy, harvest festivals, May Day dances, midsummer bonfires, Christmas feasts. Music and song were constant companions. People played fiddles, flutes, drums, and bagpipes. They sang as they worked, as they rested, as they drank. Dancing was a communal affair in barns, in courtyards, in the open fields. And beauty, it was everywhere. In the changing sky, the blooming hedgerows, the sparkle of frost on a roof, the stories told by firelight, the embroidery on a homespun tunic, the color of a ribbon at a market fair. Love existed, so did laughter. People cared for their children. They comforted the sick. They honored their dead. They prayed. They hoped. We must not let hardship erase humanity. The myth of passive acceptance. Another myth suggests that peasants meekly accepted their lot, that they never questioned authority, that they trudged through life without protest. But history tells a different story. Peasants did rise, they rebelled. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 saw angry peasants storming castles. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 brought thousands to London, demanding better treatment, lower taxes, and an end to serfdom. In the German lands, the Bundscha movement and the German Peasants' War of 1524-25 shook the foundations of feudalism. These were not mindless mobs. They had leaders. They wrote manifestos. They quoted scripture. They wanted justice. Even in quieter times, resistance took subtler forms, evading taxes, stretching the truth in the manor court, working slowly, hiding extra harvest, relocating without permission. They were not passive. They endured, but they also dreamed of better lives. The myth of the forgotten class. Lastly, there is a quieter myth, that the peasant has been forgotten, that their lives vanished without a trace. It's true, we have few personal records, no diaries, no memoirs, no letters home. The voices of the peasant class were rarely written down, but they echo in the margins, in court rolls, in manorial records, in wills and tax lists, in church documents and folk songs, in the shapes of old hedgerows and the foundations of crumbling cottages. Archaeology fills in the gaps. So does comparative study. We sift through layers of pottery, fragments of fabric, the remains of meals, the footprints of hearths. And we listen, we imagine, we empathize. In doing so, we begin to hear them, not as shadows, but as people. Mothers, fathers, lovers, workers, rebels, storytellers. Their myths may fade, but their lives endure. There's another quiet assumption woven into our modern imagination of the medieval peasant. The idea that their lives never changed. That generation after generation, things stayed the same work, the same tools, the same roles, day after day, year after year, century after century. But if we pause for a moment, we'll see this wasn't true at all. While change in the medieval countryside was slow, very slow by today's standards, it was not absent. The rhythms of rural life were adaptive, responsive, even innovative in their own modest ways. Take tools, for example, the heavy plow, or carruca, introduced into parts of northern Europe around the 9th century, allowed deeper tilling of heavier clay soils. This wasn't just a technical detail. It transformed farming in entire regions, making land more productive and allowing communities to expand into areas previously unsuitable for agriculture. Or consider the three-field system, a rotation of planting in which 1/3 of the land lay fallow, 1/3 held grains, and 1/3 legumes or other crops. This was not universal, but where it spread, it boosted yields and improved diets. More food meant more people meant change. Architecture evolved, too. Early medieval peasant homes were simple post-in-ground huts with thatched roofs and open hearths. By the later Middle Ages, these structures became more stable. Stone foundations were added, chimneys emerged, windows appeared. The homes grew with the families. Markets also expanded, trade routes opened. New crops were introduced, from hardier grains to fruits, herbs and spices that filtered into peasant cooking from distant lands. Even something as simple as the return of Roman-style millstones changed how bread was made. Finer flour, better loaves. And peasant life wasn't untouched by larger forces, the Crusades, the rise of guilds, the growth of universities, or the slow but steady push of state building and taxation. These weren't remote events. They had ripple effects, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, even in tiny villages. So no, the medieval countryside was not timeless. It breathed, it shifted, it adapted. Peasants may not have welcomed all change, but they were not strangers to it. The myth of the emotionless past. Sometimes we view people of the past as emotionally muted, as though grief, love, joy, or longing were somehow less powerful in medieval hearts than in our own. We imagine peasants as hardened by survival, dulled by repetition, resigned to their fates. But we need only look, gently, into the fragments they left behind to see this myth unravel. In the lullabies sung to children, in the morning rituals for lost infants, in the love poems scrawled by farmhands, in the quiet prayers offered for good harvests, safe travels, or the recovery of a sick loved one. These were not unfeeling people. They wept, they rejoiced, they worried, they hoped. Consider how they responded to illness and death. The Black Death devastated entire communities, and yet, survivors built chantries to remember the dead. They added names to parish rolls. They wore tokens of mourning. They processed, they prayed, they rebuilt. In times of celebration, emotion overflowed not in courtly banquets, but in barn weddings, seasonal fairs, and candlelit church masses. There was laughter, music, courtship. And in disputes, recorded in manorial court rolls, we see hurt, pride, jealousy, and the quest for justice. Someone accused another of theft. A neighbor damaged a fence. A family contested inheritance rights. These were human stories, driven by emotion. To assume that medieval peasants were emotionally detached is to deny them their full humanity. Their hearts beat just like ours. The myth of isolation, another subtle myth, is the idea that medieval peasants were cut off from the wider world, that they were born, lived, and died within a few square miles, untouched by politics, distant from religion, unaware of the larger forces shaping Europe. Certainly, travel was rare for most. Many people never saw the sea or a city. But isolation is not the same as disconnection. Religion connected peasants to a wider spiritual and cultural world. Through the church, they learned about saints and martyrs from distant lands. They celebrated festivals tied to Rome and Jerusalem. Pilgrims might pass through, carrying stories and relics. Monks preached about sins and salvation, weaving local life into cosmic drama. Royal taxes and decrees reached even the smallest manors. Wars drew men into conscription. Rebellions flared, kings rose and fell, and the news slowly, roughly, traveled on foot, by cart, by word of mouth. Markets were hubs of information. Merchants told tales. Foreign goods, even tiny things like beads or fabrics, carried echoes of faraway places. A piece of copper from a distant mine, a comb made in a town 100 miles away. Some peasants themselves traveled. Not all, of course, but more than we often think. Women married into other villages. Men sought seasonal work. Laborers moved after the Black Death when labor shortages offered better terms. Some ran away, seeking anonymity in cities. The medieval peasant world was rooted, but not sealed. It had windows, it had doors. The myth of the nameless mass. Finally, there is the myth of anonymity. The idea that medieval peasants were all the same. A gray wave of indistinct people, nameless, faceless, forgotten. But the record, where it survives, gives us names. And when we find a name, we find a person. A man named Wolfgar, fined for grazing his sheep in the Lord's field. A woman named Beatrice, who brewed ale without a license and sold it to her neighbors. A girl named Alice, mentioned in the records for helping midwives. A reeve named Henry, trusted by both lord and villeins. These names matter. They were spoken aloud, remembered by children, carved into tombstones or scribbled into margins. They remind us that every peasant was a person with their own story, their own thoughts, their own worries at the end of a long day. They lived, they mattered, and though time has blurred their faces, it has not erased them entirely. The myth of the emotionless past. Sometimes we view people of the past as emotionally muted, as though grief, love, joy, or longing were somehow less powerful in medieval hearts than in our own. We imagine peasants as hardened by survival, dulled by repetition, resigned to their fates. But we need only look, gently, into the fragments they left behind to see this myth unravel. In the lullabies sung to children, in the morning rituals for lost infants, in the love poems scrawled by farmhands, in the quiet prayers offered for good harvests, safe travels, or the recovery of a sick loved one. These were not unfeeling people. They wept, they rejoiced, they worried, they hoped. Consider how they responded to illness and death. The Black Death devastated entire communities, and yet, survivors built chantries to remember the dead. They added names to parish rolls. They wore tokens of mourning. They processed, they prayed, they rebuilt. In times of celebration, emotion overflowed not in courtly banquets, but in barn weddings, seasonal fairs, and candlelit church masses. There was laughter, music, courtship. And in disputes, recorded in manorial court rolls, we see hurt, pride, jealousy, and the quest for justice. Someone accused another of theft. A neighbor damaged a fence. A family contested inheritance rights. These were human stories, driven by emotion. To assume that medieval peasants were emotionally detached is to deny them their full humanity. Their hearts beat just like ours. The myth of isolation, another subtle myth, is the idea that medieval peasants were cut off from the wider world, that they were born, lived, and died within a few square miles, untouched by politics, distant from religion, unaware of the larger forces shaping Europe. Certainly, travel was rare for most. Many people never saw the sea or a city. But isolation is not the same as disconnection. Religion connected peasants to a wider spiritual and cultural world. Through the church, they learned about saints and martyrs from distant lands. They celebrated festivals tied to Rome and Jerusalem. Pilgrims might pass through, carrying stories and relics. Monks preached about sins and salvation, weaving local life into cosmic drama. Royal taxes and decrees reached even the smallest manors. Wars drew men into conscription. Rebellions flared, kings rose and fell, and the news slowly, roughly, traveled on foot, by cart, by word of mouth. Markets were hubs of information. Merchants told tales. Foreign goods, even tiny things like beads or fabrics, carried echoes of faraway places. A piece of copper from a distant mine, a comb made in a town 100 miles away. Some peasants themselves traveled. Not all, of course, but more than we often think. Women married into other villages. Men sought seasonal work. Laborers moved after the Black Death when labor shortages offered better terms. Some ran away, seeking anonymity in cities. The medieval peasant world was rooted, but not sealed. It had windows, it had doors. The myth of the nameless mass. Finally, there is the myth of anonymity. The idea that medieval peasants were all the same. A gray wave of indistinct people, nameless, faceless, forgotten. But the record where it survives gives us names. And when we find a name, we find a person. A man named Wolfgar, fined for grazing his sheep in the Lord's field. A woman named Beatrice, who brewed ale without a license and sold it to her neighbors. A girl named Alice, mentioned in the records for helping midwives. A reeve named Henry, trusted by both lord and villeins. These names matter. They were spoken aloud, remembered by children, carved into tombstones or scribbled into margins. They remind us that every peasant was a person with their own story. Their own thoughts, their own worries at the end of a long day. They lived, they mattered, and though time has blurred their faces, it has not erased them entirely. And so we remember the forgotten, the quiet millions who shaped the medieval world not through war or kingship, not through conquest or chronicles, but through their labor, their laughter, their fears, and their quiet persistence. These were not the names inscribed in gilded manuscripts. They did not sign treaties or build cathedrals with their names etched in stone. But their hands sowed the wheat that fed the manor, spun the wool that clothed the village, and rang the church bell that marked the hours of prayer and toil. These were the peasants, the craftsmen, the mothers and fathers, the old and the young, people who lived by the rhythms of earth and sky, who left behind no titles or legacies, and yet sustained the entire fabric of medieval life. We began with a single day, a rising sun over damp straw, a bleary-eyed child, a pot of gruel, and the muffled murmur of a village coming to life. And from that moment, we wandered together slowly, quietly, through the fabric of medieval peasant life. Each hour brought a new texture, a duty, a ritual, a kindness, or a hardship. And now, here in the quiet dark, we reflect. There's something humbling in remembering that most of human history belongs not to the extraordinary, but to the ordinary. It belongs to the unrecorded, the unremarked, the invisible. When we think of history, we often think of battles, revolutions, kings, and calamities. Yet the true weight of time rests on the shoulders of everyday people. People like the medieval peasant, who lived by the turn of the plow and the tilt of the sun, who weathered war, famine, taxes, and tithes not as distant events, but as intimate realities. Perhaps it's in their lives, quiet and small, yet endlessly meaningful, that we find something of ourselves. The need to endure, the ache of hard days, the sweetness of moments when burdens lift, a song at twilight, a shared loaf, a child's laughter echoing across a frozen field. Let us wander briefly, one last time through their world, not to learn but to feel. A pair of hands calloused by labor, skin browned by the sun, eyes squinting not at books, but across rows of cabbage and leeks. A back stooped not from age, but from decades of bending to weed, to lift, to carry. A home of packed earth and timber, smoke rising from a hearth, sometimes sweet, sometimes acrid, a pot bubbling with barley and roots, the sharp scent of salted meat, or on leaner days, boiled nettles and bean broth. Chickens clucking nearby, a pig snuffling underfoot, a cat curled beside the fire. Outside, the sound of bells, matins. Lauds, vespers, not clocks, but the call of sacred time. A reminder that each day was not measured in minutes, but in moments. Spring arrives slowly. The snow melts into muddy tracks. The first shoots push through thawed earth. Children squeal, chasing each other past the budding hedgerows. Men repair fences, women turn compost. The air smells of wet grass and hope. Then summer, long days and aching muscles. Hay to be cut, fields to be weeded. The feast of St. John, bonfires leaping. Music lilting from simple instruments, a rebec. A pipe of voice, joy always ephemeral, always cherished. Autumn follows, a season of harvesting and reckoning. Apples, barley, beans, the grind of the millstone. Smoke curling from chimneys, days shortening. Mornings colder, a sense of drawing in. And then winter, the world narrows. The hearth becomes the heart of the home. There is more sleep, more dreaming. Stories passed from mouth to mouth. Old songs hummed while sewing by candlelight. Outside, frost blooms on windows like lace. The air is still, and the stars feel closer. In the rolling hills, sprawling woodlands, and cold northern plains of medieval Europe, time was measured not in hours and minutes but in seasons. The annual cycle determined everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest, and when to prepare for the harshest season of all, winter. For peasants, the entire agricultural year was a race. A race to plant enough crops in spring, a race to nurture them through summer's heat, a race to gather and store enough in the autumn, so that they could survive through the winter months when nothing could grow, and food, warmth, and shelter were all at their most uncertain. But winter was not just a season. It was a threat. It was a relentless, unforgiving presence that demanded everything from you: your crops, your animals, your strength, your willpower. The cold came creeping in as the days grew shorter, and each night seemed to linger a little longer. The first frost arrived with barely a warning, a sign that all must be ready. Winter did not ask for permission. It arrived regardless of how much you had prepared, regardless of how long your harvest had been. In those dark, cold months, it was the elements that were in charge, not the humans, and if the preparation was inadequate, winter would demand its toll. The Little Ice Age, a period of perilous cold. During the period roughly between the 5th and the 15th centuries, Europe experienced what we now know as the Little Ice Age. Though temperatures fluctuated over the centuries, much of this era was marked by colder and longer winters. This was not an isolated event. The Little Ice Age was a time when many regions saw cooler temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and harsher winters that had a profound impact on agriculture and survival. The colder temperatures meant later planting seasons. Spring arrived late, and with it, the earth took longer to warm up. This delay impacted the growing cycle, leaving crops to mature in shorter periods before the first frost would arrive again in the autumn. If the summer was even slightly colder than usual, it could have disastrous effects on the harvest. Fields of wheat, rye, barley, and oats, which formed the foundation of the medieval peasant diet, needed longer to grow, and even the smallest change in climate could render an entire harvest a failure. What was more terrifying, however, was the unpredictability. While some years might be relatively mild, the overall trend was of colder temperatures. Late frosts could strike in May, after the planting season had already started, damaging delicate crops that peasants had been depending on. These unpredictable freezes were often enough to ensure that entire crops failed before they even had a chance to mature. And in the autumn, when the crops were finally ready for harvest, early frost or snow could descend suddenly, leaving crops frozen in the fields. Once the frost set in, everything would slow to a halt. Roads became blocked by snow and ice, and no one could get out to retrieve what was left behind in the fields. The harvest was finished, whether or not it had been a success. The consequences of poor harvests, in an agricultural society, where most people's survival depended on what they could produce from their own land. The consequences of a bad harvest were dire. For peasants, the failure of a crop could mean the difference between life and death. There was no safety net, no supermarket to run to for supplies, no state aid if the crops failed. If there was not enough grain, livestock, or stored food to last until the next harvest, families faced the long winter with almost no options. A poor harvest did not necessarily mean immediate famine. At first, it might simply mean that food would need to be rationed. Grain, bread, and meat would become scarce. Vegetables would be eaten first, and grains would be used sparingly, while animals were slaughtered early to provide the meat that would last as long as possible. But even with careful rationing, the looming threat of scarcity hung over every meal. If the cold continued, if the snow didn't melt, or if roads remained impassable, supplies could run out long before the next season of planting began. When winter came, food scarcity often led to widespread hunger. Peasants had little buffer to withstand bad harvests. Their diets were heavily dependent on a few basic crops, and any interruption to those crops could cause starvation. Wheat, barley, oats, rye, and peas were the staples. But without those, there was nothing to fall back on. And it wasn't just the food itself that was lacking. Along with a poor harvest came the absence of seeds for the next year's planting. And without seeds, even the promise of a future harvest was destroyed. The deadly consequences of hunger. Hunger in the medieval period was often a slow, gnawing affliction. When people didn't have enough to eat, they didn't simply starve to death immediately. Rather, they were weakened, sapped of their energy, and left vulnerable to other afflictions. In times of hunger, the human body becomes less efficient. It burns through whatever fat and muscle mass it has stored, leaving people emaciated and susceptible to disease. When the food runs out and the weather is too cold for anyone to travel, help is rarely forthcoming. Famine could also lead to the spread of disease. Without sufficient nutrition, the immune system weakened, and diseases that might have otherwise been minor, like a cold or a cough, could turn deadly. In those days, illness was often a death sentence, as there were no antibiotics, and many communities had little access to medical care. The poor, in particular, suffered disproportionately. They lived in cramped quarters, often with several families in one room, and the lack of sanitation meant that disease could spread rapidly. Plague and other illnesses, such as tuberculosis, would spread easily among the weak, and with winter isolating villages and preventing any outside help from arriving. The deadly cycle of hunger and disease continued unchecked. The struggle for firewood, a resource for survival. Winter was not only a season of hunger, it was also a season of extreme cold. As the days shortened and the temperatures dropped, fire was essential, but the production of fire itself came with its own set of challenges. Without proper firewood, peasants faced a difficult choice. Either endure the bitter cold or risk depleting their already limited resources. In the feudal system, much of the land, especially forests, was controlled by the local lord. Wood was a resource that could be scarce, especially in densely populated regions. Peasants had limited access to the forest, and the right to gather firewood was tightly controlled by feudal obligations. If you were allowed to collect wood, you could only take what the lord allowed, which might not be enough to get through the cold winter months. In some cases, firewood could be bartered or purchased, but the cost would often be prohibitive for the poorest peasants. If the firewood supply was low, families were forced to make difficult decisions: burn less wood, and risk freezing, or burn more, and risk running out entirely before the next harvest. In these cases, families often had to gather smaller twigs, use animal dung for fuel, or even burn parts of their homes, walls, doors, furniture, just to stay warm. Every fire became a matter of life and death. The isolation of winter, as the snow piled up and the roads became impassable. Winter also led to isolation. Peasants, who were already living in small communities or isolated rural villages, found themselves cut off from the outside world. Markets stopped, travel halted. News from the larger towns and cities could take weeks to reach the countryside, and even then, the news might be of little help. The ability to trade or purchase supplies was limited, and in many cases, any outside help could be weeks, if not months, away. Families and villages became entirely reliant on their own resources, and if those resources were inadequate, survival became a waiting game. What food could be stretched through the winter? How could illness be avoided? Could any assistance be found in the form of charity? In larger cities, church-run food programs might offer help, but in smaller rural villages, charity was rare, and the community was too small to offer meaningful aid. This sense of isolation bred a kind of mental toll as well. The long winter months, often spent in dark, cold homes with little to do other than wait for the next season to arrive, weighed heavily on people's spirits. For the rich and noble, the cold could be endured with plenty of supplies and servants to handle the necessities of life. But for peasants, winter was not only a physical burden, it was a psychological one. The toll of winter on mental health. Psychological affliction, such as depression, was common during the long, isolated winters. The lack of sunlight and social isolation often caused a sense of hopelessness and despair. This affliction was compounded by the ever-present worry that food might run out, or that the cold might take lives. The burden of survival was constant, and when the prospect of death from starvation, illness, or freezing was a looming threat, mental health deteriorated. This depression was not merely a passing affliction. It was often a chronic condition, a deep mental weariness that drained the energy and optimism from entire communities. Communities often dealt with the emotional toll of winter silently, as no formal psychological understanding existed in the medieval world. Those who succumbed to this despair were often left behind, ignored in favor of practical survival. Conclusion: the ever-present threat of winter. Winter was not just a cold season. It was a harsh trial that shaped every aspect of medieval life. The cold could kill, hunger could kill, isolation could kill, the absence of fire, food, and help could unravel everything. And when it did, it often didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, over weeks or months, wearing down even the strongest body and mind. But for peasants, it was simply a part of life. There was no way to escape winter. It was something that had to be survived, year after year, cycle after cycle. It was a test of endurance, of resourcefulness, and of luck. In the end, it was the most basic of human instincts, survival, that kept people going. Winter came, as it always did, and in the end, all people could do was wait for it to pass, hoping that they had enough to make it through until the warmth of spring returned. In the medieval world, time moved according to the land. There were no clocks in the homes of peasants, no wall calendars, no apps or alarms. The year was measured in light and dark, cold and warmth, sowing and reaping. And among all the turning points in the cycle of the year, spring's thaw, summer's toil, winter's hush, it was the autumn harvest that mattered most. The harvest was more than an event. It was a verdict. It decided whether a family would make it through the winter, or whether the cold months ahead would become a gauntlet of hunger, illness, and desperation. A life of subsistence. Most peasants did not farm for profit. They farmed for survival. Theirs was a subsistence economy, one in which almost every task, every crop, every animal raised or tool used was directed toward a single goal: staying alive. There might be moments of abundance, a heavy wheat yield one year, a good clutch of eggs from the hens, or a particularly productive apple tree, but most of the time, there was only just enough to eat, enough to replant, enough to set aside for bad weather, maybe a bit more to sell at market or offer to the Lord as rent, but rarely much more than that. The land worked generation after generation, offered no guarantees. One year might be good, the next might bring blight, and through it all, the medieval peasant existed in a narrow band between hunger and hardship, knowing that everything depended on what came in from the fields at harvest time. The high stakes of autumn. Autumn was the most critical season of the entire year. It was the culmination of months of labor. The plowing in spring, the weeding and tending in summer. These efforts had built toward the moment when crops could be brought in. Fields of barley, wheat, oats, and rye were gathered by hand, bundled into sheaves and left to dry. After that came thrashing, separating the grain from the stalks, then winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so that the wind could blow away the lighter chaff. It was a labor-intensive process, and everyone helped: men, women, children, the elderly, if they could walk. They could gather. Tools were few: sickles and scythes for cutting, flails for thrashing, baskets and sacks for carrying. Everything was done with muscle and time was limited. The harvest also included more than grain. Apples and pears were picked from small orchards. Nuts were shaken from trees and gathered from the forest floor. Wild berries, blackberries, elderberries, sloes were picked and eaten or preserved. If a family kept pigs, these might be fattened on acorns before being slaughtered. Chickens were culled, some goats and sheep too. In households that had the means, the meat was smoked, salted, or dried. These preservation methods were imperfect, but they helped. Salt was expensive and not always easy to obtain, so its use was often strategic. Smoking took time and required dedicated space. Drying was the simplest, but also the least reliable. When all was gathered and stored, families could finally stop, take a breath, and calculate the winter gap, from the moment the last sheaf was tied and the last apple gathered. The countdown to spring began, and it was not a short wait. In much of Europe, the growing season ended in September or October. New crops, if weather allowed, would not be ready for harvest until the following July or August. That meant at least 9 months of living off stores. 9 months, that's a long time to stretch anything, especially perishable. Fragile goods like grain, dried beans, turnips, or salted meat. Everything had to be protected from pests. Grain lofts might be built up high to avoid rats and moisture. Pits might be dug and lined with straw to store root vegetables. Clay jars were sealed with wax. Meat was hung in smokehouses or packed in salt barrels. And still things went wrong. Mice found their way into sacks. Mold crept in with the damp. Salt was sometimes reused or thinned. Crops stored improperly spoiled early. What looked like a full granary in October might, by February, be almost empty. Rationing wasn't just wise, it was essential. And so the winter became a slow process of measuring and managing. Bread was made thinner. Stews were stretched with water and herbs. Ale, brewed from leftover grains in autumn, became a vital calorie source. It was not just a drink, it was food, a way to consume grains in liquid form that kept longer than baked bread. Brewing as preservation, ale played a special role in the medieval winter. Brewed in the weeks after harvest, it was an efficient way to use barley or oats, while also producing a drink that could warm and nourish. The fermentation process killed off many harmful microbes in the water, making ale safer to drink than water from wells or streams. In poorer households, small beer, a weak ale with low alcohol content, was brewed more frequently, used even by children. Mead and cider were also brewed when honey and apples were available, though these were less common than ale. The key point was that alcohol, even in small amounts, helped preserve calories, and in winter, calories were life. The margin for error, even in good years, food had to be stretched carefully. But good years were not guaranteed. A single hailstorm at the wrong moment could ruin a field. A wet summer could rot barley in the ground. A dry spring could stunt wheat. Crop disease, like ergot in rye, could turn edible grain into a hallucinogenic poison. And pests, worms, beetles, slugs, could devastate beans or peas. Then there were human factors. Lords might increase taxes or demand grain for feasts. War might march through the countryside and strip villages of their stores. Bandits might raid. A neighboring village in worse condition might beg or steal. And then there were the obligations. Feudal dues and tithes. Peasants did not own their land. Most worked it under the authority of a local lord. And with that arrangement came obligations. Every year, a portion of the harvest had to be handed over, either as rent, as tax, or as a tithe to the church. The amount varied, but it could be steep. A tenth of grain, a share of livestock, a cartload of hay. These dues came due in autumn, just after the harvest. And so, just as families were counting and storing, they were also giving away. Grain was measured out into sacks for the manor. Eggs and poultry were delivered. In some regions, the church demanded its share first. Only after those obligations were met could families consider what was truly theirs to live on. In lean years, this might be the difference between survival and starvation. And yet to fail to pay could mean eviction, punishment, or even imprisonment. The system did not bend easily for hardship. What you owed, you owed. The long winter mindset. Because of all this, the medieval winter was not merely a season. It was a psychological weight. People lived through it with deep awareness of how much remained. Parents knew how much grain sat in the bin. They watched the stores dwindle. They calculated how long the salted pork would last, how much flour could be spared for thickening a stew. Holidays like Christmas or the midwinter feast were welcomed but measured. A special meal meant dipping into stores. Fine if there was confidence in what was left, but dangerous if the harvest had been meager. By February, many families were running low. Lent arrived in early spring, calling for fasting, not just for spiritual reasons, but because fasting aligned perfectly with necessity. People were thin, meals grew smaller. Soup replaced bread, the larder was close to bare, and spring had not yet arrived. The spring gap, a silent danger. Between March and June came the hardest period of all, known today as the spring gap or hunger gap. This was the time when stores were almost gone, but nothing new had yet grown. It was a dead space in the calendar, a void. Even if seeds had already been planted in March, they would not be harvestable for many weeks. Root vegetables like carrots and onions might not be ready until June. Early greens could offer vitamins, but not calories. Families dug deeper. They foraged wild herbs, nettles and weeds. They thinned gruel with water. In some cases, they even ate seed grain, knowing that this would jeopardize next year's harvest, but facing no other choice. Starvation and disease. As rations shrank, bodies weakened. The winter was hard, but the spring was when hunger became deadly. Malnutrition set in. Immune systems faltered. Diseases, especially those of the gut, the lungs, or the skin, spread easily. Wounds did not heal. Children wasted away. The old passed quietly in the night. And the irony, deaths in spring weren't usually due to cold. They were due to the cumulative effects of a poor harvest the previous year. Winter didn't kill quickly, it killed slowly by attrition, coping strategies, and community support. Not every family faced the same fate. In villages where cooperation was strong, food might be shared, especially with widows. The elderly or children, lords, too, might offer limited assistance, though this depended on the lord's temperament and own fortunes. Parish churches sometimes maintained gleaners' rights, allowing the poor to gather leftover grain from the fields after harvest. Some towns held stores of grain for emergency sale. Monasteries often brewed large quantities of ale, some of which was distributed to the needy. But these safety nets were inconsistent. A bad harvest in one village might not affect the 110 miles over, but it might. And in widespread regional famines, help was hard to come by. Everyone was struggling. The verdict of the harvest. In a medieval peasant's life, everything hinged on that one moment each year, the harvest. It was the line between plenty and privation, between comfort and calculation, between life and loss. And because it came only once, there were no second chances, no do-overs, no emergency deliveries. If the harvest was good, winter was manageable. If it was poor, every day became a quiet fight against hunger, cold, and despair. It was a fragile system, but it was the only one they had. And so each year, families planted in hope, harvested in worry, and entered winter with cautious resolve, praying that what they'd gathered would be enough. Just enough to make it to spring. Chronic hunger, a quiet threat. When we think of famine, images of mass starvation often come to mind. Rows of empty bowls, mass graves, news of entire towns devastated. Indeed, medieval Europe saw cataclysmic famines like the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, where 1/10 or more of the population died. Yet far more pervasive was chronic hunger, a quiet, persistent malnourishment woven into daily existence. In most years, families scraped by on narrowly stretched stores. Grain supplies dwindled. Bread became thin and hard. Those who still had any, meals were smaller. They reserved the heartiest bits for children and the elderly, rationing everything else to get through the winter. And when supplies ran short, survival instincts kicked in. People hollowed out their stews with twigs, bark-boiled bones, acorns, nettles, and weeds, anything that wouldn't starve them to death. Yet these substitutions offered little nutrition. What had once been routine meals became feats of endurance, often eaten in silence and anxiety. The Great Famine, a sudden collapse. At times, this simmering hunger would erupt into outright famine. The Great Famine of 1315, 1317 exemplified how climate, crop failure, and population pressure combined to devastate entire regions. Relentless rain and cold destroyed spring plantings and summer harvests, decimating yields and fodder across northern Europe. Grain prices skyrocketed. Wheat quadrupled in cost in England. Bread was banned in Paris for its inflated loaf size, and salt soared awfully higher, leaving many without bread, salted meat, or sugar, with fields saturated and animals starving. Livestock died, seed grain was consumed, draft animals perished. By 1317, famine-ravaged families resorted to cannibalism, grave robbing, selling children, or elderly self-sacrifice. Winter cold amplified hunger. Imagine months of winter where the earth is hard. The paths are slick with ice or mud, and the wind shrieks across empty fields. It seeps into homes, chilling wooden walls and rattling shutters. In those conditions, every calorie mattered, and calories were running low. The combination of hunger and cold drained bodies. Every time the hearth fire was not tended, the chill set deeper. If the winter dragged on, sometimes to May or June, even the most resilient souls began to break down. The health toll. Hunger weakens the body. Even modest malnutrition weakened immune systems, slowed healing, and increased susceptibility to disease. A minor cough could spiral into pneumonia. A scraped knee might fester into fatal gangrene. Without medical care, hygiene, or nourishment, illness preyed on the malnourished. Analysis suggests that famine years, like those prior to the Black Death, left populations physically compromised, raising mortality when epidemics struck. Chronic hunger and acute famine conditions pressed people into a downward spiral. Hunger, then illness, then death. Vulnerable populations, children, elderly, and landless. While everyone suffered, impacts were unequal. Children and infants, dependent on others. With small reserves, they were the first victims. Chronic hunger stunted growth, impaired cognition, and led to high child mortality rates. Elderly and infirm, often skipped or sacrificed so others could get enough food. Famine increased their vulnerability. Landless laborers and those with small plots, lacking surplus. They had no reserves, losing tools. Oxen or livestock pushed them to starvation quickly. Landlords and wealthy peasants, better insulated by stores. Social ties and networks, though no one was safe outright. Thus, famine widened existing inequality, feeding the strong, starving the weak. Outward signs of social collapse. Hunger and desperation bred social unrest. The Great Famine brought a surge of petty theft, violent crime, and scapegoating, as people blamed neighbors or magically inclined groups for their woes. Some stories tell of desperate clergy hoarding food, or lords locking granaries while peasants starved around them. Cannibalism, child abandonment, and grave robbing, though horrifying, became whispered rumors and occasionally documented truths. Social bonds frayed, people fled villages, migrated to towns, sold their labor, or resorted to begging. Churches and monasteries struggled to provide relief amidst mounting numbers. Where institutions failed, communities looked inward, sometimes violently. Coping and survival strategies. Peasants didn't simply watch themselves starve. In times of scarcity, they employed various coping strategies. Open-handed charity, parish granaries, church soup kitchens, and gleaning rights allowed peasants to collect leftover grain, though supplies were often limited. Animal slaughter. Eating livestock early produced proteins but removed future work and breeding stock. Seed grain consumption. Eating seeds meant no food next year. Foraging, bark, roots, herbs, and wild plants supplemented diets. Ingested raw, risky, but often necessary. Communal resource pooling. Shared meals and mutual aid helped preserve the vulnerable. Religious fasting. Lent and devotional abstention echoing necessity became entwined. Peasants fasted due to hunger, not faith. These decisions reflected grim prioritization, safeguarding young and able-bodied as a hope for future survival. The cycle of winter right arrow, hunger right arrow, illness right arrow, death. As winter ended, stores had diminished. Cold had sapped health. Marginally fed bodies had contracted diseases. When spring began, rather than feel relief, many slipped into illness and death. Mortality rates peaked not at midwinter's coldest point, but during late winter to early spring, sometimes in January through March. Climate and population pressure. Several centuries of population growth had strained medieval food systems. The mild medieval warm period had encouraged expansion, but yields began declining by the late 13th century. When climate cooled toward the end of that century, ushering in the Little Ice Age, farmers grew more vulnerable. Rising population meant per family reserves declined. A bad year then threatened mass mortality. The Great Famine represented not just accident, but a structural failure, demographic pressures meeting climate stress. The trauma of hunger left lasting marks, decline of trust in church and state. Famine shook belief that secular and religious authorities existed to protect and provide. Rise in superstition, witch hunts, scapegoating, and magical devotions spiked in famine years. Cultural myths, tales like Hansel and Gretel echo child abandonment in famished forests. Stories such as the Mouse Tower of Bingen narrate hoarded food overtaken by vermin after the Lord abandons starving peasants. Famine shaped medieval culture within poems, sermons, songs, and folktales, casting long shadows. Broader consequences, foundations of crisis. The Great Famine weakened Europe just before the Black Death. Bodies starved, economies disrupted, social order destabilized. When plague emerged in 1347, dark churches barricaded towns, and weakened bodies multiplied its destructive power. Famine also altered land use, economies, and demographics, as you'll explore in chapters ahead. Reflections. Hunger was a constant threat, slowly eroding health and well-being. Famine was an ever-present specter, requiring adjustments in farming, rationing, and community solidarity. Vulnerability was widespread, but especially acute among the poor, the landless, and the young or old. Survival was precarious, balancing hope and despair through every winter. Gentle closing. Close your eyes now, and imagine a candle flickering in a humble wooden cottage. You've just finished a thin bowl of porridge, warmed by the hearth outside. Winter's hush presses against the windows. The fire crackles, the cat curls at your feet. Though hardship awaits, you are safe, tucked away from the worst of hunger and cold. Sleep creeps in, gentle and deserved. For those medieval peasants, winter would bring more struggle. But tonight you rest, and tomorrow's dawn will come.